Hey, everybody. Hey, special thanks to Adam for filling in last minute with the meditation. And I mean last minute, like as in the very last minute. So that's a brave thing to do. And I so appreciate this community in that we do this from time to time, meaning every week. We get to hear from someone here their heartfelt thoughts and ideas. Um, I don't know. It's a beautiful thing. So if you've never done a meditation here, it's not as intimidating as it appears. I really want to encourage you. What would it look like for you to write a few thoughts out and share them with the community? It's good for you, and it's definitely good for us. It helps. I mean, it gives us a sense of we are in this, and that each person's voice and experience is worth hearing from. So anyway, again, special thanks to Adam for filling in there at the last minute. All right, so I'm going to do part two of what I started 2 weeks ago, which is I'm trying to close out the year, both in terms of Terra, which is our overall theme, surrendering to Earth's intelligence. That's the line from Rilke. What would it look like for a full year just to keep coming back around? And sort of, I planted in the year also a chance for us to look at the work of Bill Plotkin, who's one of my teachers, uh, as it relates to, is there a nature-based way of looking at the human psyche? In other words, what is our psyche made up of? We know it's nature, but is there a way of talking about it in a more nature-based sense? And that is the book Wild Mind. I thought I'd bring it today. And that's the map we've been looking at for the last year during the seasons. I did one in the fall. We talked about the West. In the winter, we talked about the North. In the spring, we talked about the East. And here we are in the summer talking about the South. And this map or this model is simply a symbolic or metaphoric way of talking about the psyche and also our facets or capacities for wholeness. So I want you to look again at the little map that's on your sheet of paper, because I want to everything I'm doing is a drive-through version. If you want to know more, buy the book. Okay, this is just a teaser, really. But I think it's a teaser that hopefully has captured your interest as we've been moving around the year. So the four archetypes that are connected to the four cardinal directions and also the seasons are the nurturing generative adult. It's the North. The East is the innocent sage. The West, on the other pole, is the muse beloved. And the South is the wild indigenous one, which I introduced us to 2 weeks ago. The wild indigenous one. Trying to make the case that in you, in your psyche, you have an innate wild indigenous one that is full-blooded and full-bodied, that loves emotion, that is erotic and sensual, and can do cartwheels on the beach, even if you're not physically capable of it right this minute. That kind of wild, indigenous, of the earth person is part of who you are. You can see it still in a 4-year-old who would gladly just swim naked in Lake Michigan, whereas as an adult, we would arrest that person, okay? But they're of the earth. That part of you still lives. And that was part of the talk 2 weeks ago. And the question is, what would it look like for you to cultivate this facet of wholeness? And one of the things I mentioned was that in the Western world, the South facet of wholeness is one of the most suppressed. We don't like it. We don't like really emotional, wild, at-home people running around in bare feet who are sensual and erotic. We think we have to keep a lid on that. Otherwise, they're going to, who knows, get me into trouble or cause trouble or something like that. The South facet of wholeness is one of the more suppressed. It's not the only one. This map, by the way, is not for you to find yourself and say, I'm a South person and I'm a North person. The map is saying something like, all four capacities rest in you. And to be an adult is to have some access to all four capacities. You need both the wild indigenous one and you need a nurturing generative adult. You need both. If you're a wild indigenous one and you expect other people to do the adulting for you, you're not very healthy or whole. Make sense? What I want to talk about today, it was funny because Valerie was like, we're really looking forward to today's talk because we're going to be talking about the wounded child. Who looks forward to talking about a wounded child? But one of the things that Bill Plotkin makes a case for is that these four facets of wholeness have immature or underdeveloped dimensions. Okay? And those come out in the form, to use psychological language, of subpersonalities or complexes that tend to run the show of your life. And these complexes or subpersonalities are on automatic pilot. You don't consult them. You don't get into a situation and say, you know what I'd like to use right now is my wounded child. It comes out of the basement of your psyche and runs the ship. Okay? And you, most of the time, aren't even aware of it. Everyone else might be aware of it, but you yourself are unaware that you are activated by this subpersonality or complex that we would call the wounded child. And let me tell you something. Everybody has a wounded child. Some of us, our wounded child is so big that they make these giant balloons of us sucking a pacifier and use it in floats, if you have any idea what I'm talking about. Okay? Each of us, honestly, can carry around a float like that. There's my wounded child up in the sky sucking a pacifier. Okay? If you have no idea what I'm talking about, I'm just going to leave it at that. We have wounded children, and where do they come from? They come from our childhood wounds and experiences. And everybody has traumas, abandonments, and rejections from childhood. You cannot help it. Nobody gets out of it. I don't care how good your parents are. If you went to a nice little school and everyone was polite and kind and was fully mature in the raising up of you, it's still going to happen. You're going to have wounds. It's part of the human experience. We are wounded. And when we're wounded as children, which every child is, we develop coping strategies for those woundings. Those later we would call the subpersonalities of the wounded child. In a kid, let me say this as plainly as I can, these are not bad. Okay? No subpersonality is bad. They're part of the coping strategies we all develop in order to survive the war of childhood. And that's exactly what it is. Childhood is a war. And as a child, you simply don't have the psychological and physical maturity to handle the war of life itself. So you develop these strategies for survival. When you get rejected by someone or your parents, when you're abandoned by someone or your parents, when you experience these little wounds, you develop strategies so that it doesn't happen again. You don't develop them like in the sense of, you know what, I need to develop a strategy. And you ask your friends, hey, any good strategies that I could develop to sort of help with these abandonments that I'm feeling? No, they happen automatically as reactions. And there's nothing wrong with that. We need them, and they do help us survive. I'll give you a tiny example, because I was trying to think of some this week that are on the more mild side, so I don't turn this into a personal therapy session. But I remember when I was a kid in the 6th grade, I played the trombone, which is not a good instrument if you weigh 65 pounds. And every day, my mom, which now that I think of it, was quite an act of sacrifice on her part, would meet me at the end of our dirt road. We lived a dirt road that was a mile long. I'm sure when you were kids, it was 2 miles long. But anyway, uphill, yeah, exactly, 2 miles uphill. But this being the 80s or 90s, I guess, 80s. This would happen in the 80s. It was only a mile long. Anyway. And for some reason, the bus was late. And I saw my mom, as the bus came around the corner, beginning to pull away on the dirt road, like as if she had been waiting and then decided, I guess he's not coming. I don't know how she would conclude this. But I got off the bus, and I ran across the street with my trombone, which is a feat in and of itself. And she just kept pulling away faster and faster and faster and leaving me literally in a cloud of dust. And I'm crying, And in the 6th grade, you don't want to be crying, all right? And you don't want to be playing a trombone anyway, but I'm running and crying. And And it was a wounding kind of experience, I would say. You say, that's mild. I agree, it's mild, but it doesn't matter because the kid of me was just experiencing. I'm just a kid. I'm just in the 6th grade. And my mom drove away and left me in a cloud of dust. And I had a mile walk to think about this event. By the time I got home, I developed something of a cool strategy, like as if this was no big deal. Set my trombone down. I didn't walk in the door and say, you know what, I felt abandoned and rejected by you, and I felt like no one is ever going to help me again, and what am I even doing out here, and do you even love me, and I guess I'm unlovable. Okay? I didn't say any of that, which is probably what was going on. Instead, automatic pilot, I developed something of a, I know how to prevent this from ever happening again. I will be so cool, and I won't need anything or anybody. Therefore, I will prevent this in the future. That's a coping strategy. Okay? When the child gets wounded. And here's what I would say about wounded child coping strategies. They're so effective that you carry them with you into adulthood. And you employ them anytime you're rejected or abandoned or traumatized or any such combination of those things. Out of the basement they come. Have I made sense? Just as kind of a brief introduction. So the wounded child tries to get his or her needs met, basic needs met, through these kind of emotion-fueled strategies that are on automatic pilot. And I think one way that's helpful to talk about the wounded child is to talk about 4 manifestations of the wounded child that you can probably recognize. And I'm going to give you 4 that are in the book. If you want more, you can do your own reading and digging. So here are common versions of the wounded child and how they deal largely with a sense of abandonment, because that's at least how psychologists tend to talk about what's at the core of the wounded child. They've been abandoned. Whether they have or not is not relevant. You could say they're not really abandoned, but it doesn't matter because the child's psyche experiences this rejection as abandonment. So anyway, here are 4 that you might recognize. Strategies. Number 1 is the conformist. It's actually the most common in the Western world. And I'm not saying you're one or the other. You probably have access to all 4 of these strategies. But here's the conformist. The conformist says something like this. I know what to do so that I don't experience rejection and abandonment. I will conform to whatever the group thinks I should be, therefore I won't be hurt. That's the conformist. And sometimes it will come out like this. Let's say you have a wild, exuberant personality for dune grass. Okay? You just are fully emotionally in love with dune grass. You watch the way it swirls. I'm talking about as a kid. The way it swirls, you can hear it in the wind. You love it. But your neighborhood friends think nature's stupid. Like, oh, nature's dumb, let's play video games. And of course, you experience that as a child as a form of rejection. So you say, I never want to feel this again, so I love video games and I hate nature. And if you were to stop that kid and say, do you really hate nature? You know what they would say? Yes, I do. That's how strong the conformist is. Because if the conformist is activated, I will not be hurt as long as I belong to the group. And we live in a Western culture driven by conformity. Why do people have such wild, passionate attachments to their political group, to their church, to their worldview, to their team? And by the way, the Women's World Cup starts at 11 o'clock today, and I'm going to do everything in my power to watch the United States beat the Netherlands. No offense to you Dutch people. And you should definitely watch it. It's a cultural phenomenon, and these women are doing incredible things globally for women in general, we could say. So watch the game. We should cut talk back extremely short, like 5 minutes, so that you can get there, okay? Anyway, I went off in no man's land. What was I talking about? The conformist. Why are people so wildly attached to their team? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. Why would you be so into Michigan State that if you lost, you would flip over a car and light it on fire? You're not on the team. You can't even play basketball. It doesn't even make any sense. It has to do with the conformist, wounded child. I don't know who I am unless I'm part of a group. And if I step out of that group, I experience the fear of my own utter aloneness. And who would want to feel that? Okay? So conformity works. And it's one of the primary strategies. The problem is, of course, in midlife, you start to wonder, who am I? Am I a Lions fan? What does that even mean? You know? And who would want to be one in the first place? That's the conformist. Okay, number two. Another manifestation is the victim. Okay? The victim is sensitive to talk about right now, especially because you have people who have been victimized by real events, real circumstances, and real people. The victim subpersonality is actually future-oriented. It is ultimately rooted in some kind of abandonment or trauma or rejection, the victim, but its strategy is, this will not happen to me again in the future, so I will play the victim in the present. And that comes out in the form of displaying some injury or need. I'm in need, I'm already injured, I'm victimized, somebody needs to take care of me, and thankfully we have tons of enablers in our culture, so it's easy, if you're a victim, to find someone who can rescue you, but you play that card ahead of time to prevent future abandonments, rejections, and traumas. And we live in a culture where there are a lot of victims around a lot of different things. It's become even a sense, a kind of, I don't know what you would call it, it's kind of sweeping all kinds of cultures and circumstances that you can play such a card. It's very hard when someone plays the victim card. It's very hard to even have a conversation. Do you know what I'm talking about? As a subpersonality, it comes up and runs the ship. Okay? Have you ever found yourself in such a position? That's number two. Number three is the rebel. Okay, I know how this will never happen to me again, abandonment or rejection. I don't give a shit. That's how it will. I will put up a wall, say, I do not conform. You cannot hurt me. I even wear clothes to prove it that I'm such a rebel. I don't need you, and I don't need the mall, okay? That's the rebel mentality. That's how you put up the wall. It says, no one can touch me. The irony about the rebel is it's just a more disguised version of the conformist. I know this because this is one of my subpersonalities. You end up conforming to other rebels. And you're like, yeah, we're so unique in our rebellion. It's kind of a bit silly. But why is it a survival strategy? My rejection and abandonment will not get to me because I'm so cool it can't hurt me. That's the rebel. I don't want to sit here and smoke my cigarette under a no smoking sign, you know, and then flick it at someone. That's the sort of rebel mentality. And the fourth one is the prince or the princess. Okay? They too are angry. Remember, the South is about emotions. So you have to when you start digging into these sub-personalities, you have to ask, what's the emotion? Anger, fear, sadness, what would be other ones? Guilt, jealousy, shame. Those are the underlying emotions. But the prince or the princess is also angry, but instead of going into victim, I'm injured, okay, and the victim is very often unaware of their anger, the prince or the princess has some contact with it, but their response to it is, I'm owed something. Okay? That's the prince or the princess. It's the subpersonality of entitlement. This should not happen to me, of all people. You, not a problem, because look at you, you're kind of a mess. Me, I'm owed this, I deserve this, I should be treated. No one has the right to treat me this or that way, that kind of thing. That is going in the direction of the prince or the princess. This is the entitlement kind of sub-personality. Maybe you know a few of these people. Okay? I'm sure you're not one, but maybe your sister is. Okay? So again, these are common versions of the wounded child. And what's interesting is just to take these little archetypes and sort of turn them over in your mind a bit. Where do I recognize these? The conformist, the victim, the rebel, and the prince or the princess. What's, I think, amazing is a little hard to do it, to turn it right on the bat toward oneself, but if you can even begin to look at the world a little like this, and if you start to ask the question, when someone is behaving like a conformist, a victim, a rebel, or a princess, can you see the wounded child? That becomes part of the invitation. Can you see the wounded child? That's a very different kind of question than why are they acting that way, or they shouldn't act that way, or look how idiotic that they're acting that way, and I can't believe that they're acting that way. If you were a good parent, you wouldn't talk to a child that way, would you? If you're a bad parent, you probably would. But if you're a good parent, you wouldn't shame someone for having strong emotional reactions to painful and difficult situations. After all, we're talking about pain. The wounded child is in pain. And it's coming out in the form of these sort of classic archetypes or images. Have it made sense? Okay, so what again is the wounded child? So I'll give you a day world example. And this came up, I was talking to a friend of mine the other day, and we share something in common, which is occasionally people have very strong reactions to us. Okay? And they're not neutral. Sometimes they're quite negative, we might say. So one day, I walk into a coffee shop with my daughter. And it's a nice hot day, and I order 2 ice mochas, all right? Because I'm so manly, I need an ice mocha. And but I don't like whipped cream on the ice mocha, just as a side note. And I order them, and the barista makes them. She's hard at work back there doing her thing, and she sets them on the counter. And I forget that, or I remember, I guess would be the right way to put it, that I forgot to say no whipped cream. Right? So that's what I say. I forgot to say no whipped cream. Could you just, scrape it off there? And she looks at me, and she picks up the ice mocha and turns around and slings it against the back wall of the coffee shop. Clearly she has a problem, not me. And I'm in a very long line of people, okay? And of course, I'm speaking to her, and they're all lined up behind me. They have no idea what I said. All they see is that she picked up and slung this ice mocha. And everyone in the coffee shop, including the millennials on their Mac computers, blogging or whatever they're doing, all turn and look at the scene, all right? And then she screams, "You did not say please," picks up the second ice mocha and slings it against the back wall. This is a great story. Yeah, wow. So then I get angry. Although if you would stop me and say, "Are you angry?" I'd say, "There's not an angry bone in my body." But I'm angry largely because I'm embarrassed, and everybody is not looking at her, they're looking at me. Like, what did this guy do to this nice barista who's just trying to do her work here? I'm sure he called her a terrible name or some such thing, and everyone's looking at me. And of course, she's let everyone know that I did not say please, which I begin to argue that I did actually say please, which is not the most effective strategy. And then the manager gets involved and says, "You don't need to pay for these, let us make you other ones." And for some reason, I insist on paying. I think I'm trying to make some kind of point. I have no idea, but I'm like, of course, I'm not angry, but anger-like things are coming out of my mouth that could be perceived as anger. And I'm saying, I am going to pay for these. I'm going to pay for both of these full price right now. I do not want a deal, and I want my ice mochas. And it's turning into kind of a scene, you might say. And I pay for the mochas, and I take them out, and I don't know what I'm feeling. I don't know. Do I feel good about this interaction? For most of the afternoon, I'm totally gripped by supreme blame. There's no way that anything I did caused anything that happened. Now, this was a few years ago, like when I was just a couple years ago. So it wasn't that long ago, actually, now that I say it. So let's take a look at this scene. I'll try to be objective, and I'll try to say what subpersonalities were activated. And I'm guessing because, nobody stopped the two of us and sat us down and said, let's have a group therapy session here, which is what we both needed. But let's try to make some comments. So I'll try to speak objectively about this. And here's my first basic comment. 2 wounded children were involved. Throwing an ice mocha against a wall is a temper tantrum that a 2-year-old would have, okay? Me strutting around self-righteous is also a kind of tantrum, okay? There's no empathy. There's not an empathetic or compassionate bone in my body. I'm just embarrassed and ashamed and full of blame. That's a wounded child. So what we can say is 2 wounded children met each other in a coffee shop one day. So we'll start with her. And here is, I'm just guessing. It's possible that something like the prince or the princess subpersonality was involved. And it might be saying something like this. And this is all mostly unconscious. I'm better than working at a coffee shop. People overlook me. They don't care. I'm actually a talented artist and I'm wasting my time and energy trying to make money. Or it could be, my parents told me that I have to get this job, even though I look at my dad and he doesn't work. I'm owed something more. That would be the prince or the princess. I'm owed something more. This is beneath me. And me simply coming in with the energy that I was coming in with activates that, and next thing you know, there's an ice mocha against the wall of the coffee shop. Possible. It could be something like a victim gets activated here. And the victim might say something like, nobody notices that I'm in pain. This person is clearly so oblivious. Such a man here who clearly does not see that I'm in pain, that this is a difficult day, and that nobody cares to ever say please. They just want what they want, activates that victim. Next thing you know, I don't know if a victim would throw an ice mocha against the back wall. Maybe. We could say something like that. Could be. Could be even a rebel that says something like, I'm sick of the man and his institutions and our culture of privilege and whatever. You can go on. I don't know. Those are guesses into. Of course, I can't read into it because all I witnessed was what happened. What happened with me? Who was the Kent that walked in? Because I don't think please had much to do with it. I really don't. There must have been something about my energy. And maybe my energy was something like this. In walks Prince Kent. Ordering is beneath me. Okay? This coffee shop is beneath me. Look at these. They don't even work. What are people doing in here in the middle of the day? I'm in there in the middle of the day, I might add. Who knows? I'm above the polite culture. Being polite is stupid. Now the rebels getting involved and saying, that's right, being polite is stupid. These are contrived social institutions designed by patriarchy. I'm not playing by these rules, okay? Anyway, if I come in with that energy, and it is an energy, that's what a subpersonality is, you better believe it's going to activate someone wherever their energy is. And so again, 2 wounded children walk into a coffee shop, and next thing you know, there's smashed coffee on the wall. Okay? So that's about as best I can do is sort of how might you recognize these in sort of the day-to-day world. So let me try to answer very briefly, and I only mean, again, McDonald's drive-through version of any of this stuff. How do we work with wounded children? Because I promise you, your wounded child gets activated probably almost every day, if you're honest about it. Someone slights you, or it can even be something that's on television right now, or the news article, or even a memory. We don't know. and something of the wounded child may be activated. So I'm just going to give you a series of questions and some ideas. I'm going to talk about one more thing. So, how to work with wounded kids. First of all, if you can, as a mature person, begin to say, what are my patterns? That is a massive leap forward in gaining some distance from you and being hijacked by the personality itself. What are my patterns? Of this list, the conformist, the victim, the rebel, the prince, or the princess, if I'm really honest, which one do I play out? You probably are not able to recognize it in the moment. Best to do it now, unless one of them is activated. But when you have some distance, and maybe with a friend, do you see any of these patterns in me? Because sometimes a friend, now if they say something and you flatly deny it and get angry, it's true. Okay? So what are my patterns? And what sub-personalities most hook me? Okay? Another one that I'm sure many of you have done, and it's not fun, but what are my wounds? Really, what are they? What core events and circumstances, how am I wounded? And what are some of my core, my therapist used to call it my core scripts that are connected to my core wounds. It's important to be able to say, yep, I have at least some awareness of what my core wounds are, my core wound and my core script. And even knowing that, already it's a bit humiliating, but it's almost as if the capacity to be hijacked from it, it doesn't go away, but it lessens a bit. All right, I'm prone to feeling unloved, for example, or I'm prone to feeling unworthy. Those are some of my core wounds and scripts. And some of that actually requires going back, which is slow, difficult, and painful work. It really is. I know there's a lot to be said about presence and remaining present and the gift of mindfulness. But I think this kind of stuff, you have to look backwards. You have to say, how did I end up here? And what are some of my wounds that I've been carrying up to this point? Another interesting thing about this book, Wild Mind, is that, and this is part of the direction, I mentioned this a couple weeks ago, of depth psychology in general, they're starting to say, hey, it's very important to look specifically at our wounds and problems. But what we often do not do is cultivate our facets of wholeness alongside it. In other words, psychology has become problem-focused instead of cultivating the whole person. And that's the future. And when you're cultivating the whole person, you actually do gain increased resources for dealing with your wounded parts. The great example of that is in this map. If you cultivate the nurturing generative adult, guess what you can do with your wounded child? Pick him or her off the ground and say, I know how you're feeling. I know what it's like to be rejected. I empathize with you. Only you can do that for yourself ultimately. And that's your nurturing generative adult. Other people aren't going to do it for you. They can build a bridge. That's a good therapist or a good friend or a good partner can see you in your woundedness and help build a bridge until you can cultivate such a capacity on your own. Have I made sense? A good question is actually first start abstractly, how would I treat a wounded child that's been rejected or bullied or hurt? How would I treat them personally if I was the nurturing generative adult? How would I speak to that child? And then ask yourself a question like, how do I speak to myself when I'm feeling particularly vulnerable? Because that's at the core of the wounded child. They feel vulnerable. And a nurturing generative adult knows how to speak to that wounded child. Have I made sense? So these are questions that I think are worth turning over. And I think I want to add one more component here that is along the more mysterious side of things. And that has to do with a principle that is as old as all myths and stories. And it's kind of a secret in a way, a secret hidden in plain sight. And the secret is something like this. Your core wounds are sacred. First of all, they're sacred. And they have something to do with your gifts. They create are a part of your core sensitivities to the world. There's a mysterious dynamic between your wound and your gift. I don't know if you know who Henry Nouwen is. He has a great book. The title of it expresses this. He calls it The Wounded Healer. That your capacity to heal is somehow mysteriously connected to your wounds. And that doesn't justify them. You don't say, hey, I'm so glad I'm wounded so that I have a gift. I don't think it works that way. It just creates a kind of sensitivity. Someone who has been mocked and bullied, who begins to integrate that and deal with that later in life, has an enormous sensitivity to people who are bullied. They know what it's like. It creates a kind of empathy that you can't have otherwise. And so it becomes a kind of question. And I think in a room like this, we can ask a question like that. What are your core sensitivities? What are the ways in which your own wounds have shaped the way you see the world, and potentially even your gifts? And I don't think you can ask these questions until quite a bit later in life. And to begin to see, I think as the mystery between these things. And in that sense, I'll read you a little bit from this book, and I'll remind you of some quotes you've probably heard before. So listen to this. An impeccably assembled ego, one that never encountered a moment of supreme self-doubt, would be invulnerable to falling apart. Sometimes we think that would be the goal. If only I could not fall apart, and my ego would remain fully intact, never harmed. It goes on. Soul encounters require that we first die to who we thought we were, then be plunged into a period of not knowing, during which we might uncover a mystery. What's he saying in short? Something of your ego has to crack for you to plunge further. In other words, there has to be a kind of wounding. He goes on. A seamless ego that in no way doubted itself would never be motivated to leave, quote, home. To leave its adolescent story, would never second guess its conventional life trajectory, would never wander off into the mysteries of nature and psyche, and would consequently never reach true adulthood. Mystery then sees to it that we are born with a core vulnerability, one that will be actuated or precipitated by certain kinds of wounding events. Leonard Cohen says, there's a crack in everything, that's how the light gets in. All right? There's a crack in everything. There's a crack in you. That's how the light gets in. I don't know why it's this way. Don't blame me. There's a Taoist saying, there's a hole waiting for the boar's tusk. Meaning there's a hole in your psyche, there's a crack, and you're going to be wounded. It's just the way it is. And that's in part how the mystery gets in. Your core sensitivities and vulnerabilities is both the place you get wounded and the place from which your gifts spring. That is a mystery. And I think it has to be handled with a certain amount of sacredness. We can't talk about it cheaply, and we certainly can't talk about, I hope so-and-so is hurt so they'll find their gifts, all right? It's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a kind of mystery where the crack that's in us is also the area where the light gets in. I don't know if you've ever seen Native American rugs that have one thread that's off, or the Bedouin make these rugs that are striped, and right down the middle they put it slightly off-centered, communicating the very same thing in a very tactile sense. Nothing is perfect, not even you, and not the soul, and that's what makes it beautiful. The imperfection is what makes it beautiful. That's communicating the very same mystery. That's something that's the imperfection in you is also an area where beauty is to be found. So that's going down, I think, into the deeper levels of our own woundedness. So, where do you go from here? I don't know. I know. Let me end with just a few lines of the poem, which hints at, I think, the mysteries of the places where we're wounded in childhood and sort of the gift of the underside of that. Sometimes when the light strikes at odd angles and pulls you back into childhood, you ever get that feeling? Like all of a sudden you're sucked back into childhood. Like the forest has a certain kind of smell to it, and all of a sudden you're like 7 years old. Where did that come from? What's happening? And you are passing a crumbling mansion completely hidden behind old willows, or an empty convent guarded by hemlocks. Like you can't quite see what's in there. And giant firs standing hip to hip, and you know again that behind that wall, under the uncut hair of the willows, something secret is going on. So marvelous and dangerous. That's that magic capacity. That's that wound gift dynamic. Something marvelous and dangerous. Because it's dangerous to walk toward these things. That if you crawled through and saw you would die, or the ego might die, or be happy forever. Thanks for listening.